In 1890, in what was then Cheyenne in the Oklahoma Territory, a young woman went about her daily chores. The place had an agricultural profile: dirt streets, a general store, a church, and a post office. The railroad advanced slowly. Modernization was uneven, coexisting with farming practices and indigenous frontiers. In 1888, a portrait was taken of Lily Mae Smith Tucker, a woman of Cherokee descent and daughter of leader Nimrod Jarrett Smith. The image documents the presence of the Cherokee Nation in the post-Civil War period in western North Carolina and is part of the ethnographic cataloging efforts of the time. Marcia Pascal belongs to a lineage marked by Lieutenant Colonel George W. Pascal and by ties to Cherokee culture. Her life story is told through family records, military memory, 19th century displacements, and the passing down of names, trades, and ritual practices. Photograph of Hattie Tom, a woman of the Chiricahua Apache tribe, taken by Frank Reinhardt around 1898. The portrait shows clothing, posture, and ornaments and serves as a source to study Chiricahua identity, social roles, and ritual practices at the end of the 19th century. A photo from 1890 portrays a young Lakota girl. The framing and clothing show the use of garments and adornments of the period in the midst of U.S. assimilation pressures. The record serves as a historical source. It allows observation of identity, cultural practices, and family memory preserved. Sawatainyuk, a youth of the Kwakwakawaku Nation on the northwest coast, lived around 1914. Daily life included fishing and gathering, rituals in communal houses, and learning languages and genealogies. He took part in potlatches despite colonial restrictions, preserving kinship lines and authority. In the photograph, there is a girl, her identity not recorded, standing and holding her bowls. The copy is in platinotype, a process widespread in the 19th century. The authorship is attributed to Adam Clark Vroman, with an approximate date of 1860 according to archive records. The scene suggests a domestic context. The photograph, dated around 1900, shows a teenage girl from one of several Native American tribes. The record, typical of the early 20th century, documents clothing, posture, and social context, offering clues about cultural practices and colonial contact at the time. Inusk, daughter of a Kickapoo chief, appears in sources around 1880. Her life connects her family's political authority to the preservation of rituals, language, and exchanges with other peoples. As part of a leading lineage, she symbolizes the group's continuity in times of migration. Julie Nelson, born in 1886, was of Native American descent. She belonged to a specific indigenous people and lived under assimilation policies at the end of the 19th century. She kept ties with the land, rituals, and subsistence economies of her community. Alice, born around 1900, had uncertain tribal affiliation. Sources place her among the Cayuse, Walla Walla, or Umatilla peoples of Northeast Oregon. The ambiguity comes from fragmentary records of the period and from crossed family ties in Pacific Northwest villages. In 1900, basketry among the Apache was a central women's craft. Women then called in sources squaws, a term now considered offensive, made baskets for ritual and domestic use, with straw, reed, sweetgrass, and cedar strips, using weaving and twisting techniques passed down through generations. In 1910, a portrait of a young Arapaho woman records a moment of transition on the Great Plains. With ceremonial clothing, beads, and traditional hairstyle, she signaled family ties and status. The image, produced by itinerant photographers, documented cultural practices under federal pressure. Minnie Lou Ottinger Bradley, born around 1900, appears as a figure whose life sheds light on the turn of the century. Amid urbanization, railroad expansion, and struggles for civil and voting rights, she witnessed changes in work, domestic life, and U.S. politics. A 1909 photograph shows Nora Barada Murphy, a resident of White Cloud, Kansas. Identified as a member of the Iowa Nation, whose historic territory covers Kansas and Nebraska, the portrait highlights clothing, ornaments, and hairstyle as markers of identity and cultural continuity. In 1923, Ada Lopez Richards, a woman of the Tolowa Nation, exemplifies the indigenous experience in the Pacific Northwest. Her presence records practices, clothing, and community ties of a people who for centuries occupied the coastal regions of Northern California and Southern Oregon. Anna Cash represented for her community the cultural continuity of the Cayuse. She wore dresses, beads, and ceremonial blankets whose designs reflected ties to territories and lineages. By 1910, these practices were already under pressure from Western schooling and missionary expansion. A 1908 photo shows a young Sioux girl, a member of the Plains Nations in North America. She is dressed in ceremonial clothing, sewn hides, feathers in her hair, and beads in geometric patterns. The portrait documents material practices and forms of presentation in the early 20th century. In 1939, a photograph recorded June Welch, a young Cherokee woman wearing full ritual dress. The framing highlights patterns, beads, and fabrics that recall practices passed down through generations. The image serves as a historical source, preserving ways and identities in transformation. Lena Geronimo was born in 1886 at Fort Marion, Florida, during the final stage of the campaigns against the Apache. Daughter of the Chiricahua leader Geronimo, she came into the world while he was imprisoned as a prisoner of war at that fort, a fact that marked her family's story and the memory of exile. In 1910, a young Kiowa woman lived on the Great Plains, between settled villages and seasonal movements. Under the colonial system of the reservations, she took part in the household economy, preparing food, making crafts, caring for children, joining ceremonies, and keeping oral stories and knowledge alive. Josefa Rios, a member of the Tohono O'odham people, also called Papago, was active around 1900 as a community reference. She took part in rituals, teaching the language, and passing on agricultural knowledge, helping to preserve practices and collective memory while reinforcing local identities. In 1892, a young Kiowa woman appears in ceremonial dress, a leather gown, hand-worked beads, fringes, and geometric designs. Her clothing shows practices passed down through generations and highlights cultural continuity in the midst of changes in Kiowa territory. Juanita Buck, a Dakota Sioux woman active in the 1880s, faced reservations, missions, and federal policies. In her community, she preserved language, rituals, and family stories. As a witness of the time, she told of territorial changes, conflicts, alliances, and losses that shaped her people's destiny. Goldie Jamison Conklin, a Seneca woman from the Allegheny Reservation, was part of the Native American community in the early 20th century. In 1910, a photograph shows her in traditional clothing, with beads and robes. The record shows community practices, Seneca kinship ties, and cultural continuity. A 1900 photograph shows a princess of the Umatilla tribe in northwest Oregon. Taken by Major Lee Morehouse, a photographer and observer of the time, it belongs to a body of work documenting indigenous leadership and the political-cultural context of early 20th century United States. The chief's daughter portrays Lottie Ya Tede, a young woman of the Pueblo Nation in New Mexico, photographed in 1905 by Carl Moon. The record shows clothing and posture, placing the image within the early 20th century movement to catalog indigenous peoples in the United States and their historical context. In 1910, a young woman of the Kalispel tribe exemplifies indigenous life in the Northwest. Living near the Pend Oreille and Spokane rivers, in what is now Idaho and Washington, she took part in seasonal work, rituals, and trade, blending traditions, subsistence, and contact with settlers under assimilation policies. Dated around 1904, the photograph shows a Navajo woman in a frontal portrait with a slight smile and direct gaze. Traditional clothing and ornaments, combined with the simple framing, offer clues about daily practices and indigenous self-presentation in the early 20th century. In 1899 in Seattle, La Roche, a young woman of the Yakima tribe stood out. Her presence, recorded in newspapers and local accounts, showed the contact between indigenous peoples and emerging urban society. She became a public reference of Yakima identity and culture in the city. A 1908 photograph portrays Awe Au, Pretty Flower, of the Seneca Nation. As a historical document, the portrait shows clothing, ornaments, and posture, reflecting cultural practices and self-representation, placing the Seneca experience in the early 20th century amid political and social changes. Cao Yu Tees, a Caddo woman, was photographed in 1906 by George Bancroft. The image records a moment of transition. The Caddo, from eastern Texas and Louisiana, kept agricultural rituals, basketry, and river worship alive even under assimilation policies in the early 20th century. In 1907, Edward Curtis photographed Lucille, a Dakota Sioux woman, as part of his ethnographic project. In the portrait, she poses facing forward, with a traditional robe and hairstyle, bead necklaces and bracelets. The marks on her face show her age and ties to her community and land. Photographed in 1894, a Kiowa woman appears smiling, an uncommon gesture in portraits of the time. The record highlights her agency and suggests the social bonds maintained on the Great Plains, as the Kiowa faced confinement and U.S. federal assimilation policies in what was then Indian Territory. In 1905, a photograph shows a young woman of the Ho-Chunk Nation in Black River Falls, Wisconsin. Identified as Kate Thunder Minor, she poses with a fringed checkered shawl. The direct framing highlights her in the garment, recording presence and self-presentation. A 1898 photograph shows a young woman of the Assiniboine people on the Great Plains. The frontal pose and traditional clothing document belonging in historical time. The simple composition highlights features, ornaments, and ways of showing identity at the end of the century. Zitkala Sa, Redbird, also called Gertrude Simmons Bonin, was a Lakota writer and activist. In the early 20th century, she wrote in English about forced schooling and the struggles between tribal tradition and assimilation, opening the way for indigenous voices. Around 1900, a photograph shows a woman of the Crow Nation outdoors, beside a tent near Sheridan, Wyoming. She wears a dress decorated with elk teeth, a leather belt, and bead necklaces. The record shows clothing practices and the daily environment. Atra Ason, recorded as Bertha Thompson, appears in documents from 1914. Daughter of Milton James Thompson and Chinawa, a Yurok woman, her story shows how, at that time, civil and ethnographic records sought to fix indigenous family ties for memory and rights. Julia Ann Keka, a woman of the Umatilla Nation, appears in a photograph dated 1880. The record, typical of studios of the time, shows her community belonging and the material signs of her culture, placing her in the 19th century transition and colonial contacts in the Pacific Northwest. A 1900 photograph shows a young Native American woman of unspecified identity. She wears traditional clothing with worked ornaments and fabrics, showing community belonging. The portrait serves as a source to observe clothing patterns and indigenous youth in the period.